and welcome to the series Introduction to Ethics. In this series, I'm going to talk about ethics, which is the philosophical study of moral principles. So depending on the type of question you ask regarding ethics, there are three major subdisciplines which I'm going to cover in this series as well. When you ask what kind of principles or ethical principles, the answers to this question fall under meta-ethics. So there might be some different possible answers to this question. For instance, we can say they are the principles everyone gives to themselves. Everyone gives their own principles to themselves, and these are what makes up moral principles. This might be one possible answer. We can also say there are no principles of ethics, they are just feelings. Or someone else can say they are the principles that are widely accepted in a given culture, or they are the principles that are widely accepted in different historical periods. So as you can see, there might be various other answers to this question, but all these answers and the detailed philosophical examination of these answers will make up the field of meta-ethics. There's another subfield of ethics that we call normative ethics. And this subfield is interested in the question which principles are the correct ones for ethical behavior or policy. For instance, we might answer this question saying, you ought always to act so as to promote happiness, and any act that is in line with this principle, or any policy which is in line with this principle, is the right act or policy. Or you can answer this question saying, you ought always to act according to certain rules, which would be a different answer than the first answer. You can also answer this question saying, you ought always to act in line with the acts of a virtuous person, which is a third different answer to the question of normative ethics. Or you cannot answer this question saying you ought always to act in a way that shows care about how others are affected by your act or the policy in question. So as you can see, there might be different answers to normative ethical questions as well, and this would make up the field of normative ethics. The third major subfield under ethics is called applied ethics. And the applied ethics answers the question what ought to be done in a particular kind of issue. Under a particular kind of issue. What are the particular ethical solutions to a particular issue under question? For instance, a question might be, should physician-assisted suicide be permissible? Or we can ask how ought we treat animals, which would lead us to animal ethics. We can ask what are our duties to environment, which is a question regarding environmental ethics. Or when it comes to business ethics, we can, for instance, ask what kind of rights do workers have as workers? So as you can see, when we are examining a particular issue and trying to answer ethical questions on this issue, we are in the field of applied ethics. So these are three major subfields of ethics: meta-ethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. And in this series, I'm going to talk about all three of them. I'm going to give examples and give major arguments for and against each position or major positions in these subfields. So now let me talk about some tools for discussing ethics. One of the major tools for discussing ethics is formal logic and informal fallacies. Of course, informal fallacies is not a tool to discuss ethics, but it's something that we should be aware of and we should avoid. So let me give an example of how formal logic is used in ethical discussion. Rather than ethical discussion, let me give an example of how formal logic actually works. Formal logic is one of the major tasks of formal logic is to examine whether a given argument is valid or not. So let me explain this with an example. I'll give an argument which is composed of, it's a simplified argument, and it will be composed of two premises and one conclusion, and the conclusion is supposed to follow from the premises. And if the conclusion is following from the premises, then we will call this argument a valid argument. So the first premise in this argument is, if it's rainy outside, then I have my umbrella with me. If it's rainy outside, then I have my umbrella with me. The second premise is, it rains outside, and the conclusion that is supposed to follow from this premises is, I have my umbrella with me. So there is no way in this argument that the conclusion is false as long as the premises are true, which makes the argument a valid argument. Let me give an example of an invalid argument. So this time the first premise is this: if it's rainy outside, then I have my umbrella with me. Actually, this is the same first premise. And the second premise, I'm changing the second premise now. I have my umbrella with me, and the conclusion is it's rainy outside. So this argument is invalid because it's it's not certain that the conclusion is following from the premises, even though both premises are true. Because even if both premises are true, it's possible that the conclusion is false. This implies that the argument is invalid. So P1 implies that being rainy might not be the only reason that I have my umbrella with me. I might just have my umbrella for another reason. I might have forgotten it in my bag. So it's not it doesn't ascertain that it's raining outside. Let me give a couple of examples of famous informal fallacies. Of course, I'm not giving an exhaustive list of informal fallacies here, but let me give a couple of famous examples. One informal fallacy is circularity. In this type of fallacy, when you reach a conclusion from certain premises, the premises already imply the conclusion. So the conclusion actually is not reached through premises, but it's already implied. One famous example that you can find in any logic book is this. Premise 1, the Bible is God's word. Second premise, the Bible writes that God exists, and the conclusion, therefore, God exists. So the first and second premises already imply that, already assume that God exists and the Bible is God's word. So the conclusion is already implied in the premises. So this is a circular argument and it's a fallacy. It's a wrong type of reasoning. You should avoid this type of reasoning in any argument you're making, and in particularly ethical arguments in our subject. Another informal fallacy is appeal to the crowd. For instance, think of this premise. Take this premise. Many people believe that same-sex marriage is morally wrong, and the conclusion is, therefore, same-sex marriage is morally wrong. Here in this argument, you can see that the conclusion is derived from the fact that many people is believing in a certain situation or certain idea, and therefore the conclusion says, since so many people believe in this, it should be wrong, or it should be the case that the crowd is asserting. And this is why it's called appeal to the crowd, and it's a fallacy. You cannot reach in a philosophical manner to a conclusion just by appealing to the number of people who are asserting a certain premise. Another informal fallacy is appeal to nature fallacy. And here is an example. Take this premise. Many animals in nature eat meat and there's nothing wrong with it. Conclusion, therefore, eating meat is not morally wrong. Here in this example, the conclusion is supposedly supported by the fact that something else is appearing in the nature. Animals are eating other animals. Therefore, the conclusion says human beings can eat animal meat as well. There's no philosophical backup here. There's no sturdy philosophical backup here for this argument. It's just an appeal to nature, and it's a fallacy, and we should avoid this type of fallacies. Of course, I cannot exhaust the whole logical field of logic or the whole field of informal fallacies here. These are just certain examples that are famous in the literature. The second tool for making ethical arguments are thought experiments and moral intuitions. And let me mention two very famous ones. The first one is child in the pond thought experiment, which is given by Peter Singer. So let's take a modified version of it. On your way to the class, you see a drowning child in a small pond on your campus, on your university campus. The pond is very shallow for you, but it's not shallow for the child. The child will die unless you go into the pond and rescue him. You have your new expensive shoes and pants on you, and they'll get ruined if you go into the pond. What should you do? Many people, without hesitation, say that I should definitely go into the pond. My shoes and my trousers, my new pants are not more valuable than the life of a child, life of a toddler. I should definitely go into the pond and rescue the child. And then Peter Singer uses this case as a starting point for moral intuitions, and says, if your moral intuitions are supporting the idea that you should save the child without thinking of the expensive shoes and pants that you're wearing, then a similar situation is valid for those who are in need in Africa. You can just as easily help a child survive malaria or starvation by incurring a similar financial burden as much as your pants or trousers. So you should be, if your intuitions say that you should be saving the child in the pond, there is no reason why you shouldn't save children in Africa who are starving or who are suffering malaria. So according to this thought experiment, according to this method, this tool, this ethical tool, there's a thought experiment, and this thought experiment is supposed to shed light on your moral intuitions. And if you think these moral intuitions are sturdy moral intuitions, they're strong moral intuitions, then you can use these moral intuitions to solve another problem, which has rather more complicated situation. Let me talk about another famous thought experiment, which is called the trolley problem. So there are two cases in this thought experiment. In the trolley 1 case, a runaway trolley is approaching 5 people who are on the train track. They will all die if nothing is done. You are near a switch which you can change the track of the trolley. If you switch the track, another person who is on the track will die. What should you do? So many people, I mean not everybody of course, but many people who are asked this question are saying that okay, I should switch the track because I'll be saving life of 5 people, but I'll be letting die 1 person. But that's so unfortunate, but that's how I should be behaving. If you say this, then the thought experiment brings you second step in the thought experiment, which you might call trolley 2. A similar situation is present with a difference. Instead of changing the track this time, you can push 1 bystander to the track, whom you know will stop the train but will certainly die. What should you do? So this time, many people avoid saying that I should push the person to the track to save 5 people's life. In the first case, many people who were saying that I should be able to I should be changing the track of the trolley to kill 1 person in order to save 5 people, and the same people would hesitate in the second case, in the trolley 2 case, to say that I should push the person to the track to save 5 people. So what explains the difference between 2 decisions? This is a question that this thought experiment is trying to answer, and there are different answers given in the literature. The idea is thought experiments and our intuitions, our strong intuitions on moral cases, can be used as a tool for ethical discussions. Another tool for ethical discussions is universalization. So it's used by testing a moral situation by asking what would happen if everyone were allowed to do X. If everyone were in the same situation as the person who is having the moral dilemma, and what if everyone was able to do this, or was permitted to do this? What would be the consequences? If the expected consequences are not undesirable, then the action X is morally permissible according to this method. Of course, there are multiple variations of this method. I'm giving just a very crude version of it, which might even not be usable in this version, but this is just the idea of this tool. So I've just counted a couple of ethical tools to make you familiar with how ethical problems are thought about and how they are tried to solve. So this will be just the end of my introductory section. I'll be talking about meta-ethical theories, non-mathematical theories, and applied ethical issues for the rest of this series.